Hello, hello. Welcome from hot and steamy Taipei. But it's time for another talk about behaviorism and meaning. So today I'm talking about William James. As you can see there, William James. Yeah, of course, he's a very important philosopher. Most people, I don't know. Most people have probably heard his name or heard him quoted, heard something he said. Um, Sometimes called America's greatest philosopher. Yeah, there's debate. There's different names thrown out about that, but thrown around about who America's greatest philosopher is. But William James could be one of them. In some ways, I like William James. I find him easier to read than someone like Peirce. He's a good stylist. You might also be aware of his brother Henry James, a famous novelist, American novelist. So they're brothers, brother of Henry James. He's often a beautiful writer. There's sections of his writing which are just really nice. He comes up with some good metaphors sometimes, some really interesting metaphors. Has some good stories sometimes. So yeah, he can be fun to read. Maybe less precise than Charles Peirce, who I talked about in another lecture. There's drawbacks about James. I do find him less precise, maybe less systematically worked out. So that will maybe come up later. Let's see. He was friends with Peirce. He knew Peirce. And influenced a lot by Peirce. I don't know that he influenced Peirce very much, but he was definitely influenced by Peirce. There was a famous within philosophy or within American philosophy, there was a famous kind of philosophical discussion club in the 19th century that James and Peirce were part of, called the Metaphysical Club. It was started in 1872. And James's theory of meaning really takes off from Peirce's pragmatic maxim, which I've talked about before. I'll review it again today, but pragmatic maxim was really important to James. And he wants to apply it more broadly, basically. His idea was to take the Peirce's maxim, Peirce's principle, James sometimes calls it the principle of Peirce, and just apply it more broadly in philosophy. Again, Peirce was more interested in science and thinking about our basically scientific concepts. James wants to use this in a broader sense. So talking about metaphysical and religious concepts. And I'll just touch on that a little bit. So where are we? Yes. James, chronologically, James comes after Peirce. We're going to skip around a little bit, but James and Peirce are good to discuss together. So if you have, I would learn a little bit about Peirce. It's good to learn about Peirce. I did a lecture on Peirce already. Let's see, what did I want to mention? Well, I guess that was it for this. So let's see here. Yeah, so James on meaning. We'll talk about the pragmatic maxim. We'll talk about percepts and concepts. That was one of his contributions to thinking about meaning, is James's discussion of percepts and concepts. And so what to read if you're interested in this stuff. I'm going to be talking mostly about these two things today, these two texts today. Philosophical Conceptions and Practical Results, which is an important essay by James from 1898. And then I'm going to talk about some sections in his Some Problems of Philosophy, which was the last book that he published when he was alive. I think he died what did I say on my, he died in 1910. couldn't remember if it was 1910 or 1911. Anyway, the year he died, it came out. Yeah, so we're going to discuss, I'll begin talking about his pragmatic maxim, or his interpretation and his use of the pragmatic maxim in philosophical conceptions and practical results. I'm going to mention an anecdote that he tells in one of his most famous books called Pragmatism. He has a few, 2 or 3 really famous. He's got actually a few really famous books. His psychology, his religion book, varieties of religious experience, his book Pragmatism. Those are probably the three most famous. I'm looking at I've got my James here. I don't know if you can see that. I'm not seeing myself. Yeah, so this is the book I often use. There's many different versions of these texts. There's many different editions. So this is the one I'm using, but so I didn't put page numbers just because you might be using one of many different editions to see these writings. He's been republished in many different ways. So I didn't put down page numbers just because they won't match necessarily with what you read, but yeah, those things are worth reading if you're interested in what he says about meaning. Yeah, so pragmatic maxim, percepts and concepts. So let me review Peirce's pragmatic maxim. So I talked about this in my lecture on Peirce. Peirce gave many different statements of the pragmatic maxim. This is a relatively early one from 1878. He said, consider what effects that might conceivably have practical bearings we conceive the objects of our conception to have. So you're thinking about something, you're trying to understand something. What are the effects of that thing, the practical, real world, empirical effects of that thing? Then our conception of these effects is the whole of our conception of the object. So basically the meaning of the object is what we think its practical effects are. What we expect its practical effects will be. In philosophical conceptions and practical results, I'm going to call it PCPR because it's such a long title, but in that first essay, PCPR, James describes this pragmatic maxim as the basis of his philosophy. This is the core of his philosophy, of his philosophical thinking. He says it's the clue or compass by following which we can keep on the right philosophical path. So this is our compass for getting through the philosophical wilderness, the wilderness of ideas, and staying on the right path. If you keep this in mind, and again, he's applying this more broadly than Peirce. This is, I think, what he sees as his innovation, partly, at least part of his innovation in philosophy, is just building on this pragmatic maxim, what he sometimes calls Peirce's principle, and applying it more broadly than Peirce did. The basis of the... So he tells us, and this is very close to Peirce, the basis for the maxim is the relation between thought, belief, and action. So the function of thought is determining rules for or habits of action. Rules for or habits of action. And like Peirce, he describes these rules as beliefs. Beliefs are habits of action or rules for action, as Peirce said something very similar. So kind of the idea, thoughts help us form beliefs, and beliefs help determine our actions. Peirce, I should say, the other thing to mention is that he sees that if there's part of thought, like some element in the thought that is not functional, basically, that doesn't affect action, or experience, he'll also say, then this is not part of the meaning. So when we're talking about meaning, it's how does thought, what are the consequences of thought for action? And we'll see this when he starts talking about function later, the function of concepts. You'll see a little bit how that works maybe. And experience. I wanted to mention experience. So you see action and experience. James often talks in terms of experience rather than action. Experience is a really important word in James, and he's thinking of our practical, empirical experience in the world. So it's not just what we do, but he wants to include thoughts, maybe, or feelings and other things. So you could think about how thoughts determine further thoughts, maybe how thoughts determine how we will eventually feel in certain situations and things like that. He uses this broader word experience a lot instead of action. But there's a closeness there in the meaning of those concepts. Yeah, so thought helps us form beliefs which help determine the kinds of experiences we have. Yeah, and he says I don't think I have this on a slide, but he says the effective meaning of any philosophic proposition can always be brought down to some particular consequence in our future practical experience. Actually, I do have this on a slide. Yeah, the effective meaning of any philosophic proposition, so any philosophic proposition, comes down to some particular consequence in our future practical experience. So he's thinking about what does it mean for our future experience. So the meaning of a thought is its practical consequences informing beliefs, experiences, and perhaps ultimately actions. So if you take two apparently distinct ideas, right, you wouldn't compare two ideas that seem to be the same, but if you're looking at two ideas that seem to be different, if they result in the same conduct, the same behavior, the same experience, then they're the same idea. At least they have the same meaning. I suppose they could be different in some other way, maybe, but they could have different forms or whatever. But the meaning is the same if they lead to the same consequence, the same experience. But if they result in different behaviors or different experiences, then they're different ideas. They have different meanings. This is the way he talks about meaning. Just to give an example that this is one of his examples, and I'm going to probably butcher the pronunciation, but you have a couple of sentences at the top here. So please open the door. Of course, if you just translate this into French, you get a different sentence. Veuillez ouvrir la porte. Please open the door. Veuillez ouvrir la porte. So please open the door. So if you're in an English-speaking place and you say the first sentence, you'll get some kind of result. If you're in a French-speaking place or talking to a French-speaking person and you say the second sentence, you're probably going to get the same result. You'd expect to get the same result with both of those sentences if the person you're talking to can understand the languages involved. So they have the same meaning, even though they look different. Right? On the surface, at least, they look different, but they would lead to the same result. You would expect them to have the same result, as long as you're talking to someone who knows the language. But if you look at the second pair of sentences, got again, please open the door, and then damn you, open the door. So these you would expect to produce different results, at least in some way. Like the person might open the door, but James considers them to have different meanings. I would say they lead to different results in some aspect. They lead to different experiences, right? Particularly in the person you're talking to. So if you say, please open the door, the person will behave in one way. Say, damn you, open the door. You'd expect them to act in a somewhat different way. You might get the door open in both ways, but the result is going to be at least a little bit different. So we would say they have different meanings. I sometimes like to compare this to things we've already talked about. So Frege, looking back at Frege, we might say that each of these sentences has the same reference, right? They're both trying to accomplish the same thing, but they have different senses. Like maybe the broader idea that we understand is different. So please, so you have a politeness and you have, well, rudeness or anger or something, whatever that last damn you open the door sentence is conveying. Or in Peircean terms, Charles Sanders Peirce, you might say they have the same object, right? Again, they have the same. They're trying to get the same kind of thing done, but different interpretants because they would create a different effect on the person listening. Okay, so what else? Just a couple of things to mention about that. In this essay in PCPR, he's mainly illustrating Peirce's principle or the pragmatic maxim. He also calls it the principle of practical results. So a lot of different names for the same thing. So I guess different names, but same meaning. By looking at metaphysical and especially religious questions, James was really interested in these. Peirce was too, but I feel like James wrote about them more, and they were more central to his main work. So he's writing about things like, is theism or materialism true? What are the consequences of believing theism versus believing materialism? Is the universe one thing or many things? There's another topic he would write a lot about. So he's looking at questions like that. Questions that, there's some branches in philosophy that would consider these questions meaningless, like kind of around James's time, maybe a little after. There was a school of philosophy, positivism, logical positivism, that was skeptical about these questions. But James does think that how you answer them has some practical results. I'm not super interested in these questions, but if you're wondering what kind of results he thinks the answers to these questions have, you might want to take a look at his work. He thinks there's some way it would affect our experience in the distant future, at least. But I want to be a little bit more down to earth. I'm going to illustrate his pragmatic maxim or his pragmatic approach with something a little more mundane, which is a story he tells in his book Pragmatism, which is also collected in here, along with some problems of philosophy and other stuff. And there's a chapter in there, What Pragmatism Means, also kind of a famous essay on its own, or lecture, I believe actually was started as a lecture. And he tells a story that's kind of well known, but you may or may not have heard it before, about a squirrel. So we're talking about a squirrel. I'm going to show you some kind of bad pictures, or a bad picture I drew, to try to illustrate what's going on here in this story about a squirrel. I'm going to read through it. It's pretty clear. I might interject a few things, but this is the story he tells. I think it's right at the beginning of this chapter, What Pragmatism Means. So James says, he writes, "Some years ago, being with a camping party in the mountains, I returned from a solitary ramble to find everyone engaged in a ferocious metaphysical dispute. The corpus of the dispute was a squirrel." So the main, kind of the focus of the dispute, the main point of this dispute, the argument, was a squirrel. A live squirrel, supposed to be clinging to one side of a tree trunk. So if you look at my picture here, you've got the squirrel. This is supposed to be a tree trunk, and this is a person over here. Hopefully that's kind of clear. This human witness tries to get sight of the squirrel by moving rapidly round the tree, but no matter how fast he goes, the squirrel moves as fast in the opposite direction and always keeps the tree between himself and the man, so that never a glimpse of him is caught. The resultant metaphysical problem now is this: does the man go round the squirrel or not? He goes round the tree, sure enough, and the squirrel is on the tree. But does he go round the squirrel? In the unlimited leisure of the wilderness, discussion had been worn threadbare. Everyone had taken sides and was obstinate, and the numbers on both sides were even. Each side, when I appeared, therefore, appealed to me to make it a majority. Mindful of the scholastic adage that whenever you meet a contradiction, you must make a distinction, I immediately sought and found one as follows. Which party is right, I said, depends on what you practically mean by going round the squirrel. If you mean passing from the north of him to the east, then to the south, then to the west, and then to the north of him again, obviously the man does go round him, for he occupies these successive positions. But if on the contrary you mean being first in front of him, then on the right of him, then behind him, then on his left, and finally in front again, it is quite as obvious that the man fails to go round him, for by the compensating movements the squirrel makes, he keeps his belly turned towards the man all the time, and his back turned away. Make the distinction, and there is no occasion for any farther dispute. You are both right and both wrong, according as you conceive the verb to go round in one practical fashion or the other. All right, so this is our riddle here. Does the man go around the squirrel or not? So remember, the squirrel is going around the tree, kind of at the same, so that when the man goes around the tree, the squirrel is always behind the tree from the man's perspective. Right? Does the man go around the squirrel or not? This question's actually, you can see similarity with a lot of philosophical debates. It turns on the meaning of a key word here. So what is going around? What does it mean to go round something? Right? Is there an essential meaning to the word go around? And if we know that essential meaning, will everyone agree on the question of the debate? Well, I'm not sure everyone's going to like how James answers this question. I happen to like it because I generally like pragmatism. I generally like the practical, putting these debates in very practical terms. And James's point is that go round, the term go round, I mean, he says go round, R-O-U-N-D. I think in recent English, usually we say go around. American English, we say go around, which feels more comfortable to me. But his point is that go around is actually a category of actions. It's not really an essential kind of thing, really, but it's a category of different things, and there's maybe some similarity. And this similarity may or may not matter between different kinds of going around. So there's different, you can think of it, there's different ways to talk about your position relative to some other object. So one way that we talk about our position relative to things is to use the points of the compass. So we talk about north, south, east, west. You might think of these as planet relative directions, right? Or planet relative positions, right? I'm to the north of this other object, meaning I'm closer to the North Pole than this object is. Now I'm to the west of it, now I'm to the south of it, and so on. That's one way we talk about our position. But there's another way that we talk about position, and this is using the body, relative to the body. So you have right, left, in front of something, behind something. There's another way we talk about position. So if you want to go around, which kind of position do you have in mind? Which kind of position are you practically thinking of? Or which do you practically mean? Yeah, so another example, so it matters if the object is moving, right? So think of a house. If you want to go around a house, say you're looking at the house, you're facing the house. You could go to the left of the house, you could then go to the back, then to the right, and then back to the front. That's one way you go around the house. Okay, but say now you're in the same place, and that's south. You're in the south of the house. You could then go to the west, kind of going. Another way to talk about directions is clockwise, counterclockwise. So say you're at the south, and then you're going, I guess, clockwise. You'd go to the west of the house, then you go to the north of the house, then you go to the east of the house, then you go back to where you started at the south of the house. So you went around the house again, but in a different, judging your position in a different way, according to a different practical standard. But if the object's moving, then you have a different sort of problem, especially if the object is moving kind of in the same way you are, so that it's kind of moving at the same rate. Then you have a different problem. You might be able to go around it in one sense, but not in the other. So here we're going, I guess, in a counterclockwise, the way I have it laid out here. We're going counterclockwise. So you could say that the guy goes around the squirrel in a counterclockwise direction, right? If you're talking about north, south, east, west, right? Let's pretend that the man is west of the squirrel right now, and then he goes down to the south, then he goes around to the east side of the tree that the squirrel is on, and then he's at the north, and then back at the west. So again, in that way, he went around the squirrel. But think about his position relative to the squirrel's body. So he's always in the same position as he is to the squirrel's body, right? So he's always, if you imagine the tree is not there, he's always kind of looking at the squirrel's underside, the squirrel's belly or something. So he's never going to be at any other positions relative to the squirrel's body. He's not going to be at the squirrel's back or the squirrel's head or the squirrel's tail. He's always kind of in the same position, where if he could see the squirrel, he'd be looking at the squirrel's belly or the bottom of the squirrel's feet or something. So in body relative positions, he does not go around the squirrel. So if you want to, this is a very kind of mundane or a little bit silly example. But the point is that it does matter how you bring these concepts down into something more particular, something more specific, right? Because concepts can be very abstract. So James talks a lot about, like, God. Does God exist? Do other minds exist? Another classic philosophical question. So how you answer that depends on what you actually practically mean by these terms, right? James wants to bring these down into the practical level. Otherwise, we just don't know what we're even talking about. There has to be some practical intersection with human experience. So we need to know, in a practical sense, what does God mean? What does mind mean? What does it mean to exist? These are the kinds of things the kind of concepts James wants to help us understand, to illuminate, to understand in a practical sense. So with this in mind, I spent probably too much time talking about squirrels, but with this example in mind, let's turn to his discussion of percepts and concepts in his last work, Some Problems of Philosophy. Oh, yeah, that was, I was going to show the compass relative positions. So yeah, according to the compass, he goes around the squirrel. According to the positions of the squirrel's body. He does not go around the squirrel. So James on percepts and concepts. In some problems of philosophy, in the chapters on percepts and concepts, I think there's three of them maybe. I'm focusing on one or two of them here. By percepts and concepts, James is talking about the classic philosophical distinction between things and thoughts, or things and words, right? That's you might have heard the famous phrase, words and things, or things and thoughts, or something like that. This is what James is trying to get at. It doesn't really talk so much about language, unfortunately, but yeah, that's the philosophical area that he is getting into here. So how are they different? How are they related? How are percepts and concepts, things and thoughts, different? What is the relation between them? That's what he's trying to figure out here. Things are what are known to us by our senses, perceptions. We have perceptions, or he's just going to say percepts. Those are things that we know in the external world. But when our external senses are closed off, when your eyes are closed, when your ears are plugged, I guess, when you aren't smelling anything or touching anything, you can still have thoughts or concepts. So he's relating thoughts to concepts, external sensations, experiences of the external world as percepts. And there's in philosophy and psychology, there's many terms that mark this basic distinction. So other people will talk about immediate versus mediate experience. So immediate versus mediate or mediated experience. Presentation versus representation. And he's going to talk about, he says that he's going to use sensation and feeling as similar to percept. So he's covering things like sensation and feeling. And then idea, he doesn't really make a distinction between idea and concept here. Other people will make distinctions between all these things, and we'll see some of that in other lectures, but James is a little bit loose with language. There may be good and bad things about that. So he talks a lot about the perceptual flux. So the perceptual world, perceptual experience, the perceptual flux, what is available to the external senses. He says this in itself is meaningless. It's a meaningless unity. There's no natural breaks between things, no natural borders. Everything flows together. It's when you bring in concepts that things get broken up. And he says, this is a famous line. He says, without conception, the perceptual flux appears as what someone has called a big, blooming, buzzing confusion. This is a phrase often associated with James. This preconceptual experience is a big, blooming, buzzing confusion. I guess that's not something that James came up with. He says, someone said this, but I don't think he ever says who said it. But it's often attributed to James. But it is a phrase that James used, but he doesn't claim that he wrote it. So big, blooming, buzzing confusion, the perceptual flux, the preconceptual, non-conceptual world. But we use concepts to divide the world up into discrete things. Concepts are discrete from each other because of their different meanings. So concepts are what have meanings. They are different. They can be different or similar to each other. But percepts are not discrete because they have no intrinsic meaning. So a perception for James, as James is using the word, does not have any intrinsic meaning to it. Only concepts can have what he calls meaning. Yeah, so percepts have no similarity or difference. only concepts. There's a list of some of the distinctions he makes between percepts and concepts. Right? So percepts based in external sensation, concepts not. Percepts non-discrete, concepts discrete. Percepts are not similar or different from other percepts. Concepts do have similarity or difference. Percepts meaningless, concepts meaningful. There's some difficulties here, which I'll get into a little bit in my next lecture. There's a critique of this, which I'll get into in another lecture. But I'm just trying to give the idea here. Yeah, so James points out that we're so used to living in a conceptualized world that it's very difficult for most of us to imagine or experience what pure perceptual flux might be like. What is it to experience something purely non-conceptually? And yeah, that is a difficult thing. I sometimes there's some work that I've talked about in other lectures, starting around this time in physiology, really. Edmund Jacobson, his work on relaxation, and it may be through something like Jacobson's progressive relaxation, you can get into a non-conceptual state. There's kind of different levels that you go through when you go through progressive relaxation, and you kind of get rid of parts of your, as we might say, mental baggage or cultural baggage or something. And you get to something like pure perception, where you're not seeing words anymore. You're not recognizing a word as a word, right? You're just seeing it for maybe just color, and then eventually even that, just color distinctions disappear. You might see, so difference between the color of the words and the color of the paper, and then that too kind of disappears, and you're in sort of a blank. You're not really asleep, or you don't have your eyes closed, but you're in kind of a blank state. And I don't know exactly where in that you want to say perception starts. And of course, people have done research on children as well. When do children start recognizing different kinds of objects? And so there's some ways that human organisms might or do in the course of their development experience the world non-conceptually. But as like a normal adult, it's very difficult to put yourself in that state or to imagine that state. He mentions that attention carves objects. So the way he thinks about it, attention carves objects out of the perceptual flux, and then conception names them and identifies these objects that our attention carves out of just the stream of experience, the stream of perception. So it seems like he is identifying concepts with language, although I don't think he's explicit about that. That's one of the confusing things about James. So we have all these names of objects, tables, chairs, books, laptops, trees, oceans, people, and so on. So the capacity for attention, right? The kind of organismic, neurological, whatever, physiological capacity for attention carves up the perceptual world, probably based on, I don't know, adaptation, the need to survive, things like that. What's important in our environment, our attention will carve that up for us. And we'll label them with concepts, and concepts help guide our further behavior. So he writes that concepts flow out of percepts and into them again. So it's our attention working on concepts that carves them up. We conceptualize them, and then when we act, the concepts are converted back into perception. I'll go with that for now. Let's see. He says one way he says it. There's some interesting descriptions of how this works works in James. He says, percepts and concepts interpenetrate and melt together, impregnate and fertilize each other. Neither, taken alone, knows reality in its completeness. We need them both as we need both our legs to walk on. So you can't have just perception, really, or just conception. You need both of them. He uses these interesting metaphors of interpenetrating, impregnating, fertilizing, right? So these are totally, they're different things, but they're totally necessary for each other, at least for human experience, where humans are concerned. All right, now I want to go more into concepts, because concepts are what have meaning. So what does he say about concepts? Concepts, he says, have two aspects, content and function. They have content and they have function. These are the two parts of the concept, and the meaning is the function. So there is a content, but it's not really part of the meaning. And yeah, I at least have some questions about that, and I think other people do too. But the function is the meaning, where you find the meaning of the concept. So let's see. Yeah, so this distinction is not totally clear to me. I think partly because he just does not say that much about content. I think he's maybe not that interested in it, at least in this work. So the content of a concept is the image it suggests. That's what James says, the image it suggests. Yeah, and again, it seems like he's talking about words, about language, but it's not exactly sure. So I don't know if we have something like a nonverbal concept. When he's talking about the image, it seems clear that he's talking about words. When you hear this or that word, what image flashes into your mind? So if I say a word like person, or triangle, or fast, or jump, does some kind of image flash, just for a very brief moment in your mind? I think that's what he means by the content. Yeah, if we look back at going around something, the concept of going around, what content does it have? And we might say it has competing contents, at least in some situations. Right, so that was the problem with the squirrel, is that some people had one content in mind, other people may have had another content in mind, but it was not really explicit to them. They couldn't figure out the source of their disagreement until James made it more explicit. So you might have these different contents to a phrase like going round. So passing through compass relative positions or passing through body relative positions. What is the it might have different contents. So yeah, content. And if the content is the image, one question that might come up, content making you think of something, is that just another function? Is that a function of the concept or not? So it's not exactly clear the total distinction between content and function, but anyway, there does seem to be, if you think of the concept of going round that we talked about, it does seem to have these different contents, and then how it functions is maybe how you apply that in the actual situation. So, well, I'll go on to function in a moment, but we can also think of content as something like the object in Peirce's semiotics. So I've talked about that before. In Peirce, you have the sign or the representamen, and then you have the object. So representamen here could be like a concept. And then you have the object of that, and then the interpretant. And so here content, I'm thinking of it kind of like the object in Peirce's semiotics, and the function is more like the interpretant. But James really thinks the function is the important part, so he doesn't really say that much about content. Peirce said much more about object. than James says about content. But this might be important later, especially for later behaviorism, because behaviorists were much less concerned with the idea that a sign stands for something else. So they were much less concerned with this, with the object of a sign or whatever, the object of a sentence or word or something. And they were more concerned with its behavioral impact, which is very Jamesian in some way, because James is much more interested in the function of concepts than in the content. And he actually thinks it's too much emphasis on content leads to what he calls intellectualism, and James was a big enemy of intellectualism in philosophy, sort of this passive contemplation of concepts, and thinking that concepts are the true reality, and that if you study concepts, you understand reality better. James was very empirical. He thought perception was really important, perception, action, experience, and not, he kind of did not trust this just contemplation of conceptual reality. So concepts are like the map. James, I think, somewhere talks about concepts as being like a map of reality. But as we say, the map is not the territory. So concepts are not themselves reality. It's the percepts that give us reality, or at least as much of reality as we are going to get. And concepts are just a kind of a guide to that, or a map to that. But content becomes important for other people that we'll talk about. Anyway, so going on to functional value, the functional value of a concept. It's the consequences for how we think or act, consequences for thought and action, or consequences for experience, as we've seen. So again, this I would compare to Peirce's interpretant, his concept of interpretant, as opposed to the object. Interpretant is the kind of the act or the thought or the feeling or whatever that a sign creates in somebody. So he says that particular consequences are the only criterion of a concept's meaning. So consequences are the only criterion of the meaning of a concept, and the only test of its truth. So you're relating meaning and truth. I'm not going to get into truth now. That's a whole other can of worms. Let's see, I think I have another quotation here. Yeah. So this is another statement of, well, his statement, one of his statements of the what he called the Pragmatic Rule here. He's always giving different names to it, but in Problems of Philosophy, he calls it the Pragmatic Rule. And he says that the Pragmatic Rule is that the meaning of a concept may always be found, if not in some sensible particular which it directly designates. I think this would be like Peirce's object, the sensible particular. Then in some particular difference in the course of human experience which its being true will make. If two concepts lead you to infer the same particular consequence, then you may assume that they embody the same meaning under different names. Okay, same meaning under different names. Two different concepts. We've heard this before. So he gives the example, if we conceptualize, right? If you conceptualize some object out there that you perceive as human, it means you're expecting it to act in some particular way, expecting to act toward it in some particular way, right? If I think this thing over here is a human, I'm expecting it to do different things. I'm expecting that I'm going to do different things when I'm interacting with that object. And yeah, so it makes a difference. And then future experience will show whether we were right or wrong to label it as a human. Yeah, so it could turn out to be something else. Robot, animal, monster, god. Could turn out to be better labels in the future. But again, something like human and person, so these are very similar. In a lot of situations, those are going to have the same meaning, human or person. A lot of times, those just have the same thing, have the same meaning, because we're going to, if you call this thing over here a human or a person, you're going to expect the same kinds of things from it. You're going to treat it in the same kinds of ways. Okay, going to try to finish up here, as I've been maybe going a little bit too long. Yeah, I'll skip ahead to just mentioning some other concepts that he mentions. So in one of the paragraphs in the chapter that I mentioned, I think it's chapter 4, he just gives a list of a bunch of different tricky concepts and how you would think about them, their meaning functionally. And I think this is always fun to go through. This is what I like about pragmatism and behaviorism, is how they take these complicated concepts that seem very complicated, that philosophers discuss at great length, in great depth, and just boil down its meaning into a functional or behavioral, into something functional or behavioral. So he says equal, talking about equal, that A and B are equal, for example, means that you will find no difference when you pass from one to the other, or that in substituting one for the other in certain operations, you'll get the same result both times. Substance means that a definite group of sensations will recur. So again, it's very oriented toward sensation, toward experience. Substance is just about different kinds of sensations you might have. Incommensurable means that you're always confronted with a remainder, always something left over if you're comparing to, if you have two things. Infinite is similar, or means that you can count as many units in a part as you can in the whole, more and less, certain sensations varying according to the matter. So more sensations, less sensations, I guess. Freedom means no feeling of sensible restraint. No feeling of sensible restraint. Necessity means that your way is blocked in all directions save one. It's again very, very practical. God means that you can dismiss certain kinds of fear, maybe fear of death or whatever. Cause that you means that you may expect certain sequences to happen. Like if you perceive something, certain other things are going to happen, and so on. So he talks about some of these in more detail in other places, in other parts of the book, but I like just this paragraph giving all these short little functional definitions. He talks about, do I have a slide for that? Yeah, he does mention the origin and utility of concepts very briefly. This is important though. This is in chapter 4 of Some Problems of Philosophy. So concepts came into being for practical use. This is a little bit Darwinian. James was influenced by Darwin. He doesn't talk, I think, about evolution very much, but there is that background there. So concepts help us prepare for the future, plan for action. We learn what consequences follow from objects of perception. We label them with class names that suggest these consequences. So you notice that objects have certain consequences, objects that have similar consequences, you group together, conceptualize them together. When we label a new percept with a class name, so you see something new, you give it a concept that you already have, it means you're anticipating that it will have similar concepts to other members of that category, other members of that class. So when you apply the word human to some person to something you've never seen before, right? But you recognize it, it seems to you as a human. then you're expecting it to have similar consequences as other humans that you've been in contact with and labeled as humans. One thing that's really important to me that he says is the importance of concepts is that we can perceive things in their absence. This is important for later behaviorism, so we'll come back to this idea. But we're able to talk about things or think about things that are not there at the moment, or the consequences of things. We're able to talk about the consequences of things that are not happening by using concepts. So we're able to deal with or plan for a larger part of the environment than if we did not have concepts. And it seems like he's talking about language here, basically. And a phrase I always like, he says, with concepts, we go in quest of the absent. I think this is a very key idea, a very important idea, which will come up in other lectures. And it's also Darwinian, right? It's evolutionary. Concepts help us adapt to the environment. So we're able to take more into account in our actions. We're able to take in larger distances, longer stretches of time in planning our actions because we have concepts. All right, let's finish this up. So James is important for us in bringing that pragmatic maxim into different areas of philosophy. I think his discussion of perception and conception is useful. At least it's a useful starting point. So conception is basically predictive of perception. Like, what are we going to experience? What are we likely to experience? There's some problems here, confusions, omissions. The nature of perception in James is not exactly clear to me. The content of concepts, as I mentioned, is not exactly clear. Is content epiphenomenal? Does it have a function? Is he just talking about language when he talks about concepts? Are there nonverbal concepts? So some of these questions I think will be resolved, or we'll see a different way to think about them in my next lecture, which is on Grace and Theodore de Laguna. This is the de Laguna family there. Grace is on the left. Theodore is on the right, and their kids are in the middle. This was the only picture where that I could find of them together at this kind of the same age. Theodore and Grace, I mean. So anyways, they're in some of their work, they're critiquing James and proposing their own theory of meaning, which I think is interesting to know about. So I'll talk about that next. That is all for now. If you have any questions, of course, please let me know. But that's all. So see you next time.